In verse 84, we read yet more about the Islamic call to warfare, saying, "Therefore fight for the cause of Allah. You are accountable for none but yourself. Rouse the faithful. Perchance Allah will defeat the unbelievers. He is mightier and more truculent than they." That passage is particularly telling. Allah himself describes himself as being, quote, truculent, end of quote. In verses 88 to 9, we read of Muslim violence directed toward apostates within their own religion, saying, "Why are you thus divided concerning the hypocrites, when Allah himself has cast them off on account of their misdeeds? Would you guide those whom Allah has caused to err? He whom Allah has led astray cannot be guided. They would have you disbelieve as they themselves have done, so that you may be all alike. Do not befriend them until they have fled their homes for the cause of Allah. If they desert you, seize them and put them to death wherever you find them." In this passage, we read yet once again of the Koranic free license to hunt down and murder innocent and unarmed people anywhere in the world, quote, "wherever you find them," end of quote. In this case, dissidents within their own religion. By this passage, we can understand the furor in 1988, when ex-Muslim Salman Rushdie published his book deprecating the Koran, named Satanic Verses, which furor forced Britain-based Rushdie to flee into hiding. In verse 100 we read, "He that flies his homeland for the cause of Allah shall find numerous places of refuge in the land, and great abundance. He that leaves his dwelling to fight for Allah and his apostle, and is then overtaken by death, shall be rewarded by Allah. Allah is forgiving and merciful." This passage makes further reference to the reward of Islamic fighters after death. But more importantly, although this other purported meaning, unlike the meanings of all the other passages in the Quran that we are examining here today, is not obvious from the text, I have learned that this passage serves at least partly as the basis for the so-called Islamic Hijrah, which is the process by which Muslims take over foreign lands and impose Islam upon them by the sheer preponderance of large numbers of their own people emigrating to those lands, which might help explain why non-Islamic European countries have so many Islamic immigrants and other Islamic countries so few. So this passage provides further proof that the Quran is more of a political manifesto than it is a spiritual guide to, say, personal happiness, peace of mind, ethical regeneration, purity of heart, or even just plain old enlightenment. In verse 104, we find further proof that the Islamic call to violence is not only for defensive purposes, saying, "Seek out your enemies relentlessly." The next chapter, number 5 in the Quran, is called the Table. In verse 6 of the Table, we read, "Believers, when you rise to pray, wash your faces and your hands as far as the elbow, and wipe your head and feet to the ankle. If you are polluted, cleanse yourselves. But if you are sick, or traveling the road, or if when you have relieved yourself, or had intercourse with women, you can find no water, take some clean sand and rub your hands and faces with it." By this passage, we can understand how the Quran can justify its many calls for violence against innocent and unarmed people. The Quran overly concerns itself with the cleanliness of the body to compensate psychologically for its complete lack of concern for the cleanliness of the heart. You can hate people and even kill them, but by God, don't let your physical hands get dirty with their physical blood. So it is also with the physicality of Islamic prohibitions against eating pork, drinking alcohol, etc., eating halal as they say. Contrast those Islamic physical prohibitions with Jesus' teaching that it is not what goes into a man that defiles him, because that just goes into his belly and later into the sewer. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that defiles him, because what comes out of a man comes from his heart, that is, from his attitudes or his intentions. Back again in the table, in verse 38 we find, as for the man or woman who is guilty of theft, cut off their hands to punish them for their crimes. This is the punishment enjoined by Allah. He is mighty and wise. The barbarous and sadistic cruelty enjoined by this Koranic command to cut off thieves' hands ignores the depth of poverty that may have caused someone to steal in the first place, a poverty that is commonly found in most Islamic nations today, where the wealth is typically hoarded by a royal, clerical, or sometimes even elected elite. This passage also counters its own purpose, because mutilating thieves prevents them from ever being able to work themselves legitimately out of their poverty. In verse 51, we return to the theme of not befriending people, this time with specific regard to Jews or Christians, saying, "Believers, take neither Jews nor Christians for your friends. They are friends with one another. Whosoever of you shall seek their friendship shall become one of their number." This passage shows us not only once again that Allah commands Muslims to reject the love of us outsiders toward them, but also that Muslim leaders must not allow their followers even just to hear about other religions, for fear that their followers will exit in droves from that murderous and sadistic Islamic religion and instead join the kinder and gentler types of religion that truly good-hearted people are naturally drawn toward. Just like the Mafia, another murderous organization that Islam actually resembles in certain aspects, or even just like a roach hotel. You can get in, but you can't get out. In verse 57 is more about not befriending the people of the book, as Jews or Christians are called. Then finally, in verse 60, we read about Allah's low regard for those people of the book, that is, for those Jews or for those Christians, saying, "Those on whom Allah has laid his curse, and with whom he has been angry, transforming them into apes and swine, and those who worship false gods." In January 2013, our Western world leaders uncovered a 2010 video in which Egyptian then-President Mohamed Morsi was heard calling Jews descendants of apes and pigs. And all our Western leaders condemned him for his words, but he was only quoting directly from this passage in the Koran. So if our leaders would have been sincere in their condemnation of such talk, they would also have condemned the Koran as much as they had condemned Morsi. So that ends our examination of the first 5 chapters of the Koran. But since the time of my first reading, I have learned of other passages within the Koran, but outside of those first 5 chapters, that are also worth mentioning. The first passage in the Koran that is outside of the first 5 chapters, but is also worth mentioning, is verse 13 of the 8th chapter, which is called the Spoils, and which reads, "I shall cast terror into the hearts of the infidels, strike off their heads, maim them in every limb." This passage is interesting, in a macabre way, for a couple of reasons. First, notice that Allah tells us that it is He Himself who will spread terror into the hearts of us infidels. So the Islamic terrorists themselves are nothing more than practical agents for the evil designs of their self-described, truculent, and terrorist God. This concept of Islamic terror is repeated in other places in the Quran. For example, in the 60th verse of the same 8th chapter called the Spoils, which reads, "Muster against them all the men and cavalry at your disposal, so that you may strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah and the faithful, and others besides them." So by these passages, we now can see that the spreading of Islamic terror that we in the West typically think of as being a symptom of unorthodox Islamic extremism is actually a direct command in the Koran to all Muslims from Allah through Muhammad, hence a staple of regular Islamic orthodoxy. And the reference to cavalry in this latter passage proves that warfare in the Koran is not an allegorical representation of something else. Rather, it is the bloody death and mayhem of real war. The second interesting thing about this passage is that it gives Muslims a directive as to one of the practices that they should employ in order to help Allah spread His terror, and that is cutting off people's heads, which explains why we see so many examples of that particular form of execution being carried out by modern Muslims, whether they be rogue terrorists or mainstream Muslims. The second passage in the Koran that is outside of the first 5 chapters, but is still worth mentioning, is verse 39 of the same 8th chapter, called the Spoils, and which reads, "Make war on them until idolatry is no more, and Allah's religion reigns supreme." The world conquest that is suggested by this passage is repeated in other places in the Koran. For example, in the 33rd verse of the 9th chapter, which is called repentance, and which reads, "It is Allah who has sent forth His apostle with guidance and the true faith to make it triumphant over all religions, however much the idolaters may dislike it." It is by Koranic passages such as these that Muslims justify their destruction of other religions' historical art, monuments, icons, etc., not to mention the murder of the people of those other religions. And these passages not only further corroborate that the Koran is more of a political manifesto than it is a spiritual guide to happiness, peace, regeneration, purity, or enlightenment, but also preach to Muslims that they should conquer even the entire world. I get the impression that many of the Westerners who welcome Islam into their countries do so because they view Islam as being an alternative to the Western establishment, which they hate because of its sometimes cruelty. But what these people do not understand is that Islam is seeking to become the new establishment, only much crueler than the Western kind that they have already known.